like so, and make cloth. Well, eventually they found ways to take and make several strands of cloth at once with large spindles instead of a spinning wheel, make several strands of cloth. And they found that machines could make the cloth better than the spinning wheel could. And this made clothing cheaper, more abundant, and meant that people could spend less money for clothing and more money on other things. But when cloth was woven in homes, we called this the cottage industry. In other words, the people wove it in their homes. But when it was found out that you could do it better in factories, this led to the textile industry, and this led to the factory system. Now, for those of you who don't know, I spent 27 years in a factory, namely Lockheed Martin. And we would sometimes sit at our machines and wonder if each of us had a machine like this in our home, and we could make whatever this machine makes. Would it not be cheaper? In other words, we'd sell it to Lockheed, or we'd have the machine and we'd make it, set it up in our home, and work when we wanted to. And then when we were through, we'd sell our finished product to Lockheed. Lockheed would take the part we made and put it on their airplane. But we wonder if that would not be a lot cheaper and a lot easier than doing it at a factory. But then again, that was a dream that never happened. Lockheed Lockheed did outsource its work, but not to homemakers or to private individuals, but to other factories. But again, the cottage industry was the start, and then the cottage industry led to the factories taking over, and the factories led to big machines, and the ordinary worker simply could not afford the machine that he was operating. Trade, for the first time in many, many millennia, if ever, maybe, trade involved the Americas, Africa, Europe, and the Far East. In the Americas, there was the plantation system. The plantation system was involved in the southern United States as well as what is today Latin America. Plantation system that used slaves to produce sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. And these goods, the sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee, was sold in Europe. Spain and Portugal were the first to sell goods that were made in the New World to the Old World. And then Great Britain and France eventually joined, and they eventually outdid Spain and Portugal. Social status was still determined by heredity. You didn't have as many what you call self-made men. Most people who were born poor stayed poor. Most people who were born rich stayed rich. But there were a few people who were born poor who became wealthy. That was to become more true later. Now, I want to say this. When the United States was formed, we have a clause in our Constitution that outlaws nobles. It says no person can accept a title of nobility from a foreign country without the consent of Congress, but we don't care as much about that as one did. So Queen Elizabeth has made a lot of Americans knights, and other British kings and queens have made some Americans, have knighted some Americans. So we have a few Americans who have the title of nobility, but the title doesn't mean anything here in the States. But in Europe at that time, they still had the old nobility. The nobles were at the top of the social structure. And in the armies, almost every commissioned officer in the army was a nobleman. How did you get to be a general in the army in England? Well, you had to be born into it. Now, I read a biography about John Paul Jones one time, and for those of you who don't know, he was the father of the American Navy. And if you visit Washington, D.C., they have a statue of John Paul Jones there. The Navy has put up. But John Paul Jones actually wanted to become part of the British Navy. He was born in Scotland, And he was determined to become a Navy officer in the British Navy, so he became a midshipman. But it came time for him to take the exam to become an officer. So he was asked one question, which he answered. Then he overheard someone go up and whisper to the examiner, "Scotch gardener's son." John Paul Jones was the son of a Scotch gardener. The exam was over. John Paul Jones angrily went back to his room and started packing. He said, "I'm through with the British Navy." John Paul Jones came to the United States and founded the American Navy that helped defeat the British during the Revolutionary War. The British shouldn't have done it, but nevertheless, if John Paul Jones had been born into a noble family, he probably would become a Navy officer. Having been born the son of a Scotch gardener, didn't cut it. Now, the largest group were the peasants. That word peasant you're going to see often in your study of history. It essentially means a landless farmer, or a farmer who farms, but he does not own the land he farms. In other words, he farms on somebody else's land, and he has to give a lot of the produce of that land to the landlord. By that definition, my grandfather on my mother's side would have been called a peasant if he'd been born a few generations earlier, even though in our country we don't like to use that term. A peasant is a person who farms land that he can never afford to buy. They did not have 30-year bank loans in those days. So a person be perpetually paying rent, and never have a chance to own. The peasants had to oftentimes they were free. I mean, most of the time they were free, but they had to pay heavy taxes or perform numerous services. Now, I've got to say this about the taxation of Europe, and this was even true when I was a young man. The nobles were exempt from taxes. This was true in Europe for more than 1,000 years. So who paid the taxes? The poorest of people who could afford to pay them the least. Now it got so bad that during the time of King Louis XVI of France, a man had to pay 80%, that's 4/5 of his income in taxes. 80%. Now, the nobles were exempt. This was true even when I was young. Now, in 1974, one of our vice presidents got convicted of tax evasion and had to resign as vice president. His name was Spiro Agnew. And it said if Spiro Agnew would have been in Europe, tax evasion would have been considered a privilege. The wealthy always evaded taxes. The person of noble birth always evaded taxes. And as for Queen Elizabeth II, she said, "My ancestors never paid, and I'm not going to pay." And for many years, she flatly refused to pay taxes. But some of her more close advisors, "Your Majesty, you're becoming highly unpopular fast, and if you don't change your way, you're going to become the last king or queen that England ever has. You've got to pay taxes." And it's only been about 10 or 15 years ago that Queen Elizabeth II finally decided to pay taxes. But Queen Elizabeth's one of the richest women in the world. And when one of her castles caught fire and did some $900,000 in damages, initially some government people wanted to pay, but the common people said, no, she's the richest one, let her pay it out of her own coffers. Which she did. Pay the job of repairing it. But anyway, only the richer people who could afford it the most did not pay. The ones who could afford it the least did. This meant that the rich would always become richer and the poor would always become poorer. Now, we have a tax system today to where the richer you are, the higher the percentage of taxes you pay. And now, cities began to grow at this time, larger than ever had before, but they grew before the sewer systems were adequate to take care of them. And just what I was talking about with Los Angeles a few minutes ago, these cities had a problem. You crowded too many people together without an adequate sewer system, without an adequate garbage collecting system. And the result was a lot of young children died from diseases. And in fact, even adults. A lot of your adults were immune to these diseases if they could live long enough to become an adult. They'd have these sicknesses from their children and somehow become immune. Well, they became immune because their body developed antibodies against the diseases. But children would often die because of overcrowding, because of filthy conditions. A big problem was typhus. It took us a long time to develop a typhus vaccination. Now, again, it also took a long time to develop a good, well, two things that are needed when we have a bunch of people living together in cities. You have to have a really adequate sewage system, which took mankind a long time to build, and you have to have clean water. Water in those days was often polluted. You have to find a way to get water to go through cleaning processes before it's pumped into your homes. All right. War. There was a 25-year period of relative peace beginning in the late 1600s, but it ended with, now these wars I'm about to talk about, they actually were world wars. But in history we think of World War I as beginning in 1914 and running from 14 to 1918. In actuality, the first two world wars occurred in the 1700s. The first of these world wars was the War of, let's see this. Let's see. Well, they were called the War of Austrian Succession because a woman named Maria Theresa took over the throne of Austria legally. I mean, she was the next heir she was the daughter of the king, the oldest child of the king. She took over the throne of Austria, and other nations of Europe began to think, we can steal Austria's territory. Austria's pretty big. So Prussia moved in to steal some territory from Austria, and this really upset the Austrian people greatly, particularly the Queen, Maria Theresa. The French also stepped in to grab more territory from Austria. It looked like Austria might be hacked to pieces, but Great Britain decided, hey, this will make the Prussians too powerful and make the French too powerful. So the British stepped in on the side of Austria. This was, for all practical purposes, a world war. When two nations got involved, then another one came along, and then another one came along. This war was fought in Europe, in India, and in North America. But eventually they realized that the war was expensive. Neither side could win. They got tired of fighting, and they all withdrew from the war. And all territory that was captured was returned, except for Prussia got to keep what they'd taken from Austria, the territory of Silesia. Well, another war was inevitable. Austria then aligned itself with France. Russia joined in with Austria and France. So you had Russia, Austria, and France on one side, but this time Britain joined in with Prussia, which is another way of saying Germany. Austria tried to get Silesia back, so essentially you had a second war. This war is known as the 7 Years' War. All right. First one, I didn't write it down. No, War of Austrian Succession. Don't try to memorize all of which side was on which side, because Great Britain liked to change sides, and so did France change sides. But the 7 Years' War is known to us as the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is very important in American history because it was during this war that a lot of Americans learned how to fight, learned how to make an army, and learned how to become officers. The French and Indian War prepared us for the Revolutionary War that came a little bit later. But anyway, the 7 Years' War, again, it was fought in North America, it was fought in India, and it was fought in Europe. Now, the French had captured a large portion of India, but the British under Robert Clive moved in, and they took India from the French. The Prussian army, the German army you might say, was better equipped, but they were greatly outnumbered. Russia got involved for a while, but then Russia pulled out. This they were to do later in World War I, get involved and pull out. Neither side won. Now, in American history, you'll read that the French and Indian War, the French not only lost but the French lost Canada. The French had held Canada since the days of the early colonial period, but the French lost it during the French and Indian War. Now, in the treaty that was signed, the Treaty of Paris, there were two treaties of Paris. One that ended the French and Indian War, and one that ended the American Revolutionary War. In the Treaty of Paris, the French living in Canada were told they would not have to learn English. They would not be forced to join a Protestant church. And as recently as 1995, the people of Quebec voted to stay and remain part of Canada. They decided not to break away, but they still speak French in Quebec, mostly. Most of them do speak French, and they're still mostly Catholic. But now, during the French and Indian War, one very great American got his start soldiering. The man's name was George Washington. George Washington's record during the French and Indian War might not impress you. He was beaten badly, forced to surrender one time. That was when he was leader, but then he joined General Braddock's army, and Braddock promised, when this is over with, I'll give you a commission. The problem was Braddock never lived to get through the battle. Braddock had his men march straight and tall. Some of you might know about this story. And all of a sudden the woods became alive with gunfire and arrows. The British had no idea how to fight this kind of war. They could not see the enemy. I mean, the British were used to fighting in the open fields of Europe, where there would be the British here and the enemy over there, and they'd shoot, back up and reload. The next line would shoot, and then back up. They'd form three lines. While the first two lines were backing up and reloading, the front line would shoot. Well, in this case it didn't work because the British could not see the enemy. Braddock was killed right away, so George Washington took over. The British soldiers were frightened out of their wits. So Washington tried to rally them. Washington had 2 horses shot out from under him. His coat showed 4 bullet holes. And years later, when Washington became president, an old Indian chieftain went up to him and said, "You must be sent from God." He said, "I shot at you a dozen times and you never would fall." Some people say, "Oh, this story is impossible." Nevertheless, Washington tried to rally the troops. They would not rally. It was a big defeat for the British that day. But then a new Prime Minister took over Britain, William Pitt, from whom Pittsburgh is named, and William Pitt was able to turn the war around and defeat the defeat the French, all right. British colonies then in North America became very well populated and prosperous. And keep in mind, while a lot of people moved from Europe to the British colonies, the 13 colonies, while a lot of people moved, the population of Europe still got bigger. Again, that was owing to the fact that people in those days had large families, and in the colonies, a typical family would consist of about 10 to 15 children, sometimes even more than that. And the colonies grew in population really fast, and they prospered very well. Now, the British also received Florida at the end of by the Treaty of Paris, but eventually the British gave Florida back to Spain. Now, the French lost almost all of what they had in the Americas, as well as losing India. But the French were later to get Louisiana back. And when we purchased Louisiana, we purchased it from the French, not the British. In other words, it's a story of a lot of wheeling and dealing, money being exchanged, buying and selling, a few military campaigns. But when the war was over, Great Britain had almost all the territory of the United States and Canada east of the Mississippi River. And they had most of India also. Now, the French and Indian War changed warfare. It's called the 7 Years' War in Europe. For one thing, armies got bigger and bigger. The armies, for the first time, kings began keeping professional soldiers. In other words, the kings would hire men whose whole lifetime was to be spent in nothing but soldiering. These soldiers would drill constantly. They would play war games constantly. They'd live in barracks. Before this time, if an army was needed, the king would hire some professional soldiers. But this time, the king actually kept armies, you might say, at their right hand, standing armies. And this was at its beginning during the time of the 7 Years' War, standing armies. All right. Most farmers, now this was something that was still true as recently as when I was a kid. Farmers were exempt from being drafted into the army because the agriculture was so essential, and especially in wartime, had to feed the troops. So farmers were exempted. My grandpa, my mother's son, my maternal grandfather was a farmer. And he got exempted for a while. But they would not draft farmers. This was true in both World War I and World War II, and in Vietnam. The draft law that was in effect when I was still in high school, you'd become exempt from the draft if you were a farm worker. If your father owned a big farm and you were about to inherit a farm, you'd become exempt from the draft because farming was so essential. Britain and the Netherlands relied heavily on their navies, and to this day, Great Britain will brag, we have the best navy in the whole world. Great Britain, because Britain is an island, and they relied heavily on their navy. And as for Holland, the Netherlands, it was called in, they also were on a sea coast. They relied heavily on their navy. Now, the thing about ships, conditions on ships were really bad, and folk, this is still true. I mean, I'm talking about 2019 now. Be careful if you take a cruise on a cruise ship.
I just came off a cruise.
Good for you. There you go. there might be a plague breakout, and it can, and those confined. But in those days, it was even worse. A big problem was yellow fever, which we don't have today. Yellow fever was spread by mosquito bites, but they did not know that at the time. Again, I'm not saying don't take a cruise, but be careful on one, because sometimes a plague will break out and spread like crazy among the ship, and there aren't enough doctors on board to really handle it. This still can happen, because you have a lot of people living in a confined space. Well, in those days it wouldn't, the confined space was even smaller, the sanitation was less, and they did not know enough to keep mosquitoes off of you. The discovery that mosquitoes spread yellow fever was to come much later. Yellow fever killed a lot of sailors, including some high-ranking officers, including Oliver Perry, an American Navy hero. All right. In Latin America. Latin America, you had your Spanish or Europeans, but frequently, unlike among the Englishmen, their women did not come over. So a lot of times your Spanish men married American Indian women, and the result was the mestizos. Which still makes up a lot of Latin America's population. Mestizo means part Indian and part European, mostly Spanish. Part Indian, part Spanish. These are called the mestizos. Now, the Indians were not immune to European diseases. Like I say, they didn't have cattle. So they succumbed to diseases to where 90% of them were wiped out. So the farmers, the plantation owners living in Latin America decided to import Africans as slaves. Africans had better immunity. Also, Indians could run away and they knew the hiding places. The Africans didn't. So Africans moved into Latin America also. And Latin America today is a mixture of races. Indians often married Africans. Europeans often married both African and Indian, and vice versa. Until today, we have a mixture of races. Latin America never developed the rigid attitudes about race that we find in the United States, and regrettably, I have to say, still goes on. Mulatto, they're a mixture of Caucasian and African. Now, at the very, very bottom of Latin American society were the peons. All right, now, we're going to be talking about Latin America from time to time, and here's some things you want to remember about Latin America. Until recently, they never separated church from state. Church was church, church was state, and state was church. And also they had a big, huge gap between rich and poor. The rich were very, very, very rich, and the poor extremely poor, with hardly anybody in between. Extreme wealth and extreme poverty. This was to remain true of Latin America to a large extent, even to this day. The wealth of Latin America found its way into the hands of very, very few people. All right. Okay, folks, be back in about 10 minutes or so.
No,
Yeah.
See.